Earlier, if you were listening, I work at a company called Avature in Omaha, Nebraska, which is where I am right now. It's a little weird being here instead of where all of you are, but that's the day and age we live in. So I'm lucky enough for them to let me come and do this kind of cool thing and talk about this stuff. But without further ado, hi, my name's Art. I am a crazy person. And I use that term very intentionally because it highlights this problem that we have, that we do not have a good common language to talk about what is happening in our heads and what's happening in other people's heads. And it starts to imply that we think we are separate from our own emotions. And we think that we are in total control of our own thoughts. And I'm here today to tell you that we're not. And so through the course of this talk, I'm going to talk to you about first how your experiences actually are affecting you. And then we're going to talk about me in the middle of the presentation for about 15 minutes, and you can't stop me because it's my presentation. No, seriously, it'll make sense when we get to it. But after that, we're going to talk about why you should be talking about your mental health at work. And then we're going to talk about how you can talk about it. And lastly, we're going to talk about how to overcome some roadblocks that come up as you're trying to talk about these things. Now, note, when I'm talking about this stuff, the situations here are entirely hypothetical. The advice is representative, and every situation is different. So please do not assume that it is the correct advice. So let's talk about the world, your brain, and you. Now, it isn't very controversial to suggest that we can't control what happens to us, that largely causality is this intensely complex thing occurring in our lives, and we can't really do much about it. The world is largely out of our control. You can't stop it when things happen to you. You know, if you're hit by a bus, if you have problems, if you get cancer, most of those things, well, in some cases, the cancer is predictable or preventable, but in a lot of cases, it just happens. And so when those things happen to you, it really isn't a stretch to say that those things affect you. If you happen to get cancer, it's highly unlikely that that isn't going to be affecting you emotionally, intellectually, or so on, right? On top of that, in general, we can't control our own thoughts. They tend to do their own thing. There's a study that was put out by Kwok, Lays, Koenig, Robert, and Pearson in 2019, and the title of the study was Measuring Thought Control Failure, Sensory Mechanisms and Individual Differences. We're so bad at controlling our own thoughts that they titled this, they just started with, we're bad at our thoughts, we fail at this. The money quote from this particular study is, we found that the average thought control index score was not significantly above 0. Okay, we're really bad at controlling our own thoughts. And we tend to believe what we think without really examining it. Things just pop into our heads all the time. We just take them for granted that that's what we believe. That's how we feel. This is what we think. There are whole schools of therapy built around challenging that particular concept. But we tend to just accept the things that our brain is putting out at us and buy into them, especially emotions. And those emotions can actually provably affect how we think. Donald Norman, who is a psychologist who does a lot of things in the realm of design, if you have ever worked in UX, he's huge in the UX space just because he focuses a lot on the psychology of actual design. He talks about breaking the brain down into 2 different processes. Now, this isn't like the left brain, right brain thing or anything. These are just 2 kind of things that your brain does. They can't really localize them. And so he breaks it down into the cognitive and the affective. Now, the cognitive process of your brain works kind of like you expect your brain does, okay? It's this logical, linear, functional thing that puts 1 and 1 together to get 2, all right? That's the piece that you tend to think of as your brain, or you tend to think of as thinking. But there's also this affective process. And the affective process's job is to take things that happen to you in the world, stuff that is going on, things you encounter, and to basically sort it into 2 buckets, good and bad. Excuse me. Or as Norman says, negative or positive affect. That's the psychological term for those particular two things. And the affective process is really fascinating because what you can do is turn around, and if you happen to have a negative affect applied to you, it actually diminishes your cognitive capabilities. If you are in a bad mood, you actually think worse. That's a provable effect. Contrary, if you're actually a positive affect going on, if you're in a good mood, you actually think better. Like your actual cognitive skills improve. There are actually whole schools in UX built around this particular thing. If you've ever been on like Expedia rather, any of the travel sites that pop up with like a timer and says, this thing is only good for so long, you know, that is a thing that is designed to make you fear, to make you upset and tense, and that makes you less likely to think critically about what's going on. Sorry about that. I get for not knowing muting my phone. All right, so maybe that convinces you that your emotions actually affect you. But talking about this sounds terrible, right? It is. But there are ways to talk about it that help make this first easier, and second, help make it easier to convey to other people what's actually going on. So let's talk about me for a minute. Let's talk about art. Art was born into a family with a history of undiagnosed mental health illness. Depression, anxiety, ADHD, bipolar disorder. His initial symptoms manifested in an acting out during schools and in public things in his early childhood, possibly disguised by the non-standard learning environment in which he found himself. He developed a resistance to authority and started actively masking this based on socially normative behavior in public settings or when he felt he was being evaluated. These impulsive actions resulted in a significant tensions with his family and with school teachers. And early attempts at diagnosis of these things were ineffective and failed due to a significant lack of self-engagement in the process. As a result, his family cohesion suffered, manifesting in intermittent conflicts. Art experienced a delayed entry into the public school system as a result of curriculum discrepancies between the Montessori school which he attended and the public school system. His inability to control his thoughts led to a general social isolation from his peers. And a failure of his executive functions led to an inability to satisfactorily complete schoolwork. This peer isolation led to a prolonged self-reaction formation in favor of self-isolation and a self-narrative that reinforced a prolonged depressive episode. Art finally sought treatment and was diagnosed with ADD and with clinical depression. He began a medication regime subject to frequent alterations, including a number of blood tests, which proved to have a beneficial effect on his schoolwork. On the other hand, previous behavioral and communication patterns within his family persisted, resulting in a continuing deterioration of the situation. He was voluntarily relocated to his other family members' houses during his senior year of high school. On the other hand, his social skill levels began to normalize during this time. College provided a unique opportunity for Art to normalize his skill set and to redevelop his persona in the absence of familiar environments. But eventual medication noncompliance led to a resurgence of his ADHD symptoms, with a predictable decline in his academic ability. He developed a set of personal coping mechanisms, including significant negative self-talk and artificially inflating the stress of particular assignments or particular deadlines. He also began self-medication through significant abuse of caffeine. He had moderate success in managing his ADHD symptoms until he took a job which had a significant amount of systemic stress. He began experiencing typical aversion behavior, panic attacks, anxiety attacks, and he re-entered treatment. He was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and he engaged in a year of therapy before embarking on another medication. He's been medication compliant for 7 years now, and his symptoms are 98% managed with occasional flare-ups. He continues to engage in therapy to address lingering emotional issues resulting from his childhood trauma. So that was art, right? But who am I? I always knew that I was different from other kids. I could feel it. Like they could see something that I couldn't. Like they could perceive some part of the world that didn't seem to exist for me. I didn't understand why I did things. Things would leap into my head and I would just act on them instantly. And when my parents or teachers would ask me, why did you do that? I would say, I don't know. I wasn't lying, but they didn't like that answer. And so I learned not to tell them the truth. And I learned not to trust them. And I learned how to hide myself. And so when my parents, frustrated and upset, put me into therapy, tried to get me diagnosed with something to find out what was wrong with me, I could hold it together for the length of a 45-minute session with a therapist. And I did. I knew what good boys behaved like. Now, if you're a therapist and you let an 8-year-old buffalo you, that's kind of on you. But he believed me. And he blamed my parents. And I'm sure you can imagine how well that went. And so things went downhill. When I entered middle school, it was the worst time of my life. In the US, middle school, at least where I was running in Indiana at the time, was 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And I entered in 7th grade because I went to a private school before that. And so I entered the year after everyone else had. And it was like parachuting into a World War I no man's land. All of the cliques had been formed, all of the battle lines had been drawn, and I parachuted into the middle and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I wasn't very good at social skills. I wasn't very good at talking with people, and I just didn't understand what was going on. Let me tell you, if you're ever in that situation, if you find yourself that confused, that upset, barking at people in the hallways just does not help, just as an FYI. And I started to tell myself a story. I told myself stories like this before. When I was a child, I used to believe that I was an alien, that there had been some Superman style scenario where my parents crash landed on the planet and died, and my well-meaning but ultimately completely incapable of understanding human parents had adopted me. That's how alone I felt as a child. And in middle school, I started telling myself a similar story. I couldn't really believe the alien thing anymore. So what I told myself was that I was a genius and nobody else understood me. So if they didn't understand me and they didn't want me, then I didn't want any part of them. And I would just go be myself and be alone. But that's not really any way to live. And it led to a very prolonged period of depression. Although if you can find me a middle schooler in the United States who doesn't have depression, they deserve a medal, frankly. But eventually it just got too much to bear. And I asked my parents, hey, can we try that therapy thing again? And they put me in, and this time I bought in. This time I told the therapist what was on my mind. This time I told the person what I was thinking, what I was feeling. And I was diagnosed. I was diagnosed with ADHD, or ADD at that point, and I was diagnosed with generalized depression. And it felt great. It felt like suddenly I knew something wasn't wrong with me, or something was wrong with me. I just wasn't a screw up. And when they decided to put me on medicine, and they did, I went on it wholesale because they told me it would fix things. And to be completely fair, it did. I was on horse doses of Dexedrine, which they used to give the U.S. combat pilots in Vietnam, which is a great thing to give a 15-year-old. And horse doses of Luvox, which is an antidepressant and SSRI. And things generally were okay. But my interactions with my family had been so ingrained by that point that I could piss off my father just by pretty much habit at this point. Like walking into a room and just pushing buttons on a machine, and it's like, oh, it's mad. Oh, why did I do that? That was not great. And so when my therapist said, you need to leave your family, like you need to get some separation, some distance for your, like, and you need to do it soon, I said, that's great. And so I went and lived with my grandmother for my senior year of high school. And when I finally went to college, it was fantastic. I was using this opportunity to learn how to be a different person, how to be someone who could actually interact with other humans, aided by the internet at that point in time, because that was back in a different day in the internet. And I I used that time. I became someone else, and I found a way for me to really exist in the world, which is great. Except that it was college, and we all do stupid shit in college. And my thing was, I went off my meds because everything was going fantastic. I obviously don't need these anymore. I'm sure you can imagine how well that went. I wound up graduating. I did graduate. I'm not going to tell you my GPA, but I did graduate. And I got a job. I kind of fell backwards into one. I was very, very lucky. And I turned out to be all right at this developing thing, like software development. Until I started taking a job, or took a job rather, at a company that's actually here in Omaha that makes election software. I may not look at, I totally look at, I'm a huge nerd, and I'm also a political wonk. I'm big into the political process here in the US. And so I brought a lot of my own baggage to the table on this job, but they met it pretty much bag for bag with a whole bunch of problems they had. And I started having panic attacks, which if you've never had, they're a lot like a heart attack. It's sometimes very tough to tell the difference. Heart racing, sweating, palpitations. I started having anxiety problems. I started finding myself in the car outside of work in the mornings, not sure if I could actually go inside. Now, I'm not a genius, but I am a decently smart human being. I know that that's not right. And so I went back into therapy. I turned around and I said, I need to do something with this. And I talked with the guy for a year before we both finally decided that we need to try some medication just to stabilize. And the first day on that med was like, if you've ever seen A Beautiful Mind about David Nash, it was like that where he sees all the math symbols and stuff. It was kind of like that. It was like, oh, I can just do all these things. I just do them. It's easy. I don't have to like build all these tricks into my routine or start yelling at myself about like why I can't do things, why I can't just finish stuff. It was magic. It hasn't all been, roses since then. There have been definite ups and downs, and I'm still daily grappling with my own experience about how, especially in this time, how to be effective at work, how to be genuine and human in who I am. But I found a road to what they call recovery, and I've been walking that road ever since. So what was different about those two stories? It wasn't just the pronouns that I was using third person in one and first person in the other, right? The difference was that one was in clinical language, the first one, and the second one was in experiential language. Clinical language is focused on the diagnosis. It's deficits based. It's about what you can't do, and it constrains and confines you. And it is emotionless, intentionally. Experiential language, on the other hand, focuses on what's happening to the individual. It describes and it delineates, and it's based on the personal truth of that individual. And it is by its own very nature emotional. Clinical language versus experiential language is the difference. The difference between those two is the difference between this conversation, which I've almost had verbatim, by the way, and this conversation. Okay? There's a big gulf between those two, and that is the gulf between the clinical and the experiential language. Clinical language subtracts power. It's based on passivity. It can lead to being passive, to learn helplessness. Experiential language is based on self-direction and self-responsibility. Clinical language has an external locus of power, is what they call it, where the power in the situation is outside of you. Where experiential language puts that power back in you. It has the internal locus of control. And it can encourage self-directed action and self-responsibility. But we are engineers, or at least probably most of us are, technical people. So you might ask, isn't clinical language the correct technical terminology? Which is a very valid question to ask because we love being technically correct. It's the best kind of correct. But there are problems with that. So this is the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Behavioral Disorders, edition 5. It is the big book of ways your brain breaks. And this is pretty much the Bible of diagnoses, okay? And so you might think this is great. We have it all categorized. It's like a thing, but what these things are actually made of, what this book is primarily made of, is checklists. So this book is built off of these checklists. It is built, and when you are being diagnosed, and I see in the chat somebody says in the US, and yeah, most of these, in this particular thing, most of these are the US, although I think the DSM is broadly used across the world, at least as a guideline. Since it's put out by the APA, which I'll get to in a second, but it is basically made up of these checklists. All right, it is you sitting down with your provider, with somebody who is listening to you and trying to categorize your experience. And they say, you have this, and you have this, and you have this. Congratulations, you have this particular disorder. It's sorting these things into buckets. And what I'm saying isn't that that's bad. We need these buckets to try and put our arms around this problem at all. It's really difficult, but they're not exactly precise. In addition, cultural norms can affect what's even considered to be a diagnosis. Homosexuality was a clinical diagnosis up to the DSM-3, I believe. On top of that, the duration and intensity of these particular experiences you're having are in fact part of the diagnosis. If so, like the person who is actually diagnosing you has to interpret, how long has this been going on? What is the intensity? And they're interpreting that from your description. And that means that there's even more wiggle room. And on top of that, things that we call things like anxiety and depression, they're part of the normal human experience. Being anxious, being sad and depressed sometimes is normal. When does it cross the line into being something that we can call a disorder? That becomes really difficult. So the thing I want you to take away from this is that a diagnosis is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. A diagnosis is a description of the things that can happen with that particular diagnosis. It doesn't mean you have all of the particular symptoms, and it doesn't mean that they manifest the same way for you. One person's experience of a particular disorder can be very, very different from somebody else's experience. And I tend to think about this in the sense of lived experience. All right? We, as humans, are living in the world. As we're moving through it, as we experience that world, there are ways in which we experience it. That is what they're trying to categorize. And so from our perspective, it's really, this is just how I am in the world. This is what the world is like for me. So why does talking about it matter? Well, it might seem obvious, but it's important to realize that you are the only advocate for your experience. Your experience is how you move through the world. You're the only one who can explain that to anyone else. And if you do not provide that perspective, and that perspective is always valid, if you do not provide it and you cannot ask for what you need, it's really difficult to be successful. It's like you're trying to navigate a space and just not using the tools available to you. In addition to that, sharing emotionally and sharing vulnerability actually creates team cohesion, which is really necessary for team success. This is a whole theory out of group dynamics, but sharing vulnerability actually makes people feel closer to you. We cannot sweep the affective process under the rug. The things that are being affected in the world, whether they're a diagnosis or not, the things that affect us, we cannot push those things and pretend they don't exist. Instead, we have to be able to plan for it as a team. We have to be able to adapt for it. We need to be able to say as a team, look, this is coming up. I'm going to have this problem. My sister has cancer. My dog just died. I have this particular diagnosis. Each of those things requires a different way of maneuvering and preparing for it as a team together. And it's the only way you are going to be able to place a bad story with a story from your perspective. This is the only way to really get around things. Like, there is a person that I used to work with, name's Josh, and he used to fall asleep at work. And I don't just mean like cute, like in his chair. I mean like head back, full on snoring. We made fun of him because that's like, why wouldn't you? That's hysterical, right? No. None of us ever asked him what was going on in his life. Nobody ever asked him, hey, is something wrong? Maybe he was just up late playing, Diablo 3 or whatever the hell it was out at that period in time. Maybe that was true. But maybe there was something else going on with him. Maybe there was something we could have been more compassionate about. In those moments, if you do not provide the story, I guarantee you whatever your coworkers have in their heads is going to be worse. So what keeps us from talking about these things? Well, we have a lack of good language. There's fear about it. There's a shame element to it. And there's this thing I call facile optimism, which we'll get to. Let's cover the first one. Let's talk about the language that we use. Let's practice using some of that experiential language. Now, to do this, we're going to need some examples, so we need a little help. Because we're engineers, because I understand that it's really difficult to do this sometimes. And I understand that nobody wants to have this conversation. Again, I've almost had verbatim. So let's meet Jordan and Taylor. They're going to help us through these things. Now, as we go through some of these examples, I want you to keep one rule in mind. Rule 0 is you can't solve or fix anything. You cannot fix another human being. You cannot solve their problems for them. You're not going to be able to do it. This is it. I understand the mentality, I understand the impulse, especially as an engineer. You're like, have you just tried this thing? But what you're going to do is you're going to say to somebody who's depressed, well, have you just tried smiling? Because Amy Cuddy has this research that if you put a pencil in your upper lip and you force to hold it like that, then you smile and it makes you feel better. If you do that to somebody who's actually depressed, they're going to stab you. You're going to deserve it. Just as a warning. Okay? You cannot fix somebody else's problems. You can help them, but you have to help them in the way that they want. We'll get to that. So keep this in mind. And this slide is great out of context, by the way. I have a photo of me talking in front of it. Just rule 0, you can't solve or fix anything. But yay, this is tech. Conversational type 1A is Jordan asked Taylor for future support. All right. Now, I know, again, like I said, this is hard. So I've helped provide a couple asking scripts. Like, for instance, I could really use some support. Could you please just do this thing here? Or I don't know if you knew this, but I deal with or I'm having problems with this particular kind of experience. You've been helpful to me in the past. Would it be okay in the future to ask you to do this specific thing when this specific event happens? So, for example, Jordan could say, hey, I've been having a tough time with my mood lately. You see me starting to isolate myself. Can you just take me out for a cup of coffee? I'm not going to want to. You just take me out. That's an example of asking for support, asking someone to help you. Now, ideally, Jordan is going to be clear and direct in what they're asking Taylor to do and when they're asking Taylor to do it. And ideally, Taylor isn't going to problem solve and isn't going to remember rule 0. And ideally, they're not going to promise anything they're uncomfortable doing. If Taylor says, I will help you in this way, and then Jordan comes into a moment and needs that help and Taylor is uncomfortable providing it, it's way worse than if you just said up front, I really am not comfortable doing that. Because now this other person is depending on you. Yeah. Conversation type 1B is Jordan in a critical moment asked Taylor for support. Okay, so now we have to explain what a critical moment is. Right? Mental health space, the psychologist, therapist, etc., talk about this moment of crisis. I tend to just think of it as these critical moments. This critical moment is a moment when your normal coping strategies no longer work for you. That can happen at very low levels of things. It could be something like your coping strategies just don't work for that particular thing. It doesn't have to be some huge moment of crisis or of particular stress, all right? It's just a time when the things you're used to doing that help you move don't work anymore. And they don't require a diagnosis. Well, every one of us has coping strategies, right? But we have to talk about safety in these moments because unfortunately we do. All right. In critical moments, when somebody is coming to you and talking about themselves being depressed or talking about themselves having thoughts that maybe aren't necessarily real or that they're concerned about, all right, the tendency is to just jump right into it and just, oh God, everything is terrible. Do not be alarmist, all right? Try and remain calm. It's really, humans tend to respond to other people with the energy that they bring to us. So if somebody comes to you and they're anxious and upset, it's really easy to try and to get back in that mood and to echo that mood back at them. You need to remain calm in that moment if you can, all right? Don't be alarmist. And get the facts, all right? Ask the person, are you considering suicide? Because you do not assume somebody is safe, and you do not assume someone is not safe. You can ask them, because I guarantee you, they probably have thought about it, all right? You're not going to put that idea in their head. If you have a clear and unambiguous statement of intent, that is when you call for help, all right? That's the moment you reach for 911 or whatever your particular national, crisis line is, where you call the suicide crisis center, et cetera. Those are the moments you do that. So as an example, in a moment of crisis, critical moment, Jordan could say, you might not know this, but I deal with some mood issues and I really need some help telling which emotions are moving. Now, ideally, Jordan is going to ask for whatever they need right now as specifically as possible. And they will explain that they need to leave if they feel like they need to leave the situation, because sometimes that's the only thing that's even going to come close to helping. Ideally, Taylor is going to remain calm and is not going to take that person's leaving as an insult, because it's probably not about them. Conversational type 2A is offering support. So we had asking for support. This is offering. We have an offering script, just like we had an asking script. So I noticed that behavioral observation here. Can we talk about that? Or do you think you could use action here? Can I help provide that for you? So for instance, Jordan could say, hey, Taylor, I noticed that when someone disagrees with you in a meeting, you stop talking and shut down, even though you pretty clearly care a lot about what they're saying. Would you like me to help back you up when that happens? Ideally, Jordan is going to accept a no answer. If Taylor doesn't want that support in that way, they can say no. That's their right. And ideally, Jordan is going to keep their judgments and opinions out of it. Ideally, Taylor is only going to talk about their mental health if they want to. If someone comes up to Taylor and offers support and Taylor's uncomfortable talking about it, they don't have to. But if there is guidance they can give to what Jordan could do, Taylor's going to provide guidance for that if there's something else they could do instead. Conversational type 2B then is Taylor in a critical moment and Jordan offering support. It seems like you're going through a rough moment. If you want, I can cover for you if you need to step out. Again, Jordan's going to keep their opinions and judgments out of it, ideally. And ideally, they're going to follow the support guidelines unless they've already prearranged a support request with Taylor. They could have met up beforehand and Taylor could say, in those moments, can you please do this for me? We'll talk about a tool later that will help you do that. Ideally, Taylor's going to be honest about what they need, even if it's nothing. Sometimes nothing's going to help. Sometimes you just have to take time and it's just going to go through. That's the reality of the situation. But also, ideally, Taylor is going to not assume that they're being a waste of Jordan's time. Conversational type 3 is Taylor explaining the experience to Jordan. So, like the other types, we have an explanation script for this one. When this event happens, I sometimes, often, or always feel like insert feelings here. To cope or to deal with that, I insert the behavior here. So, for example, when I'm in a meeting and someone asks me a question, my brain freezes and all I can think about is what happens if I screw up and answer incorrectly. To cope with that, I spend time before the meeting obsessing over all the things people could ask me, so I tend not to be very responsive. Ideally, Jordan is going to listen respectfully. Taylor is offering their perspective on the world, and you should listen respectfully to that. But also, ideally, remember rule 0, you're not going to problem solve necessarily when someone comes to you with that. Now, let me unpack that for a moment. This situation isn't necessarily acceptable. Jordan has a right to say, this is not acceptable to me. This isn't acceptable to my expectations of you at your job or my expectations of you as a human. And so we can talk about that. Now, you don't want to jump in and start offering solutions to the core thing about like, well, have you just tried this? What have you just tried this? Instead, you say, this is what I need you to do. This is what I'm looking for out of you. We can talk together about ways to come to that, like to get there. Taylor ideally is going to avoid blaming or ranting. It's really easy to fall into a rant in these moments or to blame other people or themselves. But also ideally, Taylor is not going to apologize for their feelings. Their perspective is theirs and they're entitled to it. Conversational type 4, then, is Taylor checking in with Jordan. So we have a check-in script like we have the others. You ready for this one? Because it's real hard. Hey, how are you doing? Right? Like, good morning, Jordan. How are you feeling today? That's an example of something we do almost, it's part of the social glue that we do together, that level of small talk. It's possible to turn those into really meaningful, hey, how are you feeling? If both sides are into that, ready to have that conversation, right? Ideally, Jordan's going to answer with as much depth as they feel comfortable, including not at all. They can just say, yeah, fine. Or one I've heard at work a lot lately is living the dream. Okay. Ideally, Taylor is going to legitimately care about Jordan. Like, you don't want to do this and really try to check in with somebody and not care about how they're doing, because it's just going to come off as non-genuine, and the other person will be able to tell. I guarantee you. Ideally, Taylor's going to maybe think about setting up a schedule with Jordan, a recurring check-in schedule. Because sometimes, even just little touch points or one-on-ones, or we're going to go grab coffee every week. Those moments can be time to do those check-ins, even when things start to get hairy. Conversational type 5 is Jordan and Taylor talking like normal humans. So I don't have a script for this because it's conversation. But as an example, hey, hello, fellow human. It's a good day to enjoy things like oxygen and carbon. It is, since I'm also clearly a human, I too enjoy these things, as well as making pleasant conversation through my mouth part. Now, obviously, I'm joking here, but the point is, once you start talking about your mental health with somebody, or they start talking about it with you, whether they have a diagnosis or not every conversation after that has to be about that thing. Okay? You can talk with other human beings like they're other human beings, not like they're a walking diagnosis or a walking problem. And I guarantee you that a person, whether they have cancer, whether they have some emotional thing, whether they're dealing with something else outside of themselves, they will be appreciative that you are helping, like, talk with them and making them still feel like they're real instead of like they're a stereotype of their particular issue. But above all of that, throughout each bit of these things, you want to remain compassionate. Both sides, whether you're asking or offering or explaining or checking in, it doesn't matter. Both sides of the conversation remain compassionate. It is difficult to have a problem, right? It's also difficult it takes energy and effort to ask somebody, hey, can I help you? That can take energy, right? We sometimes just want to hide away from those things. And so it's worth being compassionate to each other in that conversation. But this is a very important point. What if you do not want to talk about it? What if you don't feel safe talking about it, especially with that Steve guy, right? Then don't. All right? I cannot emphasize this clearly enough. If you do not trust your coworkers, if you do not feel safe at work, do not do this. I am not encouraging you to put yourself at risk of being fired, of put yourself at risk of being harmed, to put yourself at risk of trauma, okay? It takes time and energy to get to the point where you can even start to do these things. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I put out all of these conversational things because it's possible for you to start having these conversations, not because you must do this. I think it's really valuable. I think it brings a lot of things to the table as far as your team, as far as your ability to communicate with each other, especially in this current moment, to connect with another human being on a level beyond just a little square and Zoom. But you can't do this. You shouldn't do this at your own risk. So we talked about a lack of good language. The other three things I called out were fear, shame, and facile optimism. So let's talk about those. Let's start with the bottom one. Let's start with facile optimism, all right? To which you're like, facile what now? Well, facile optimism is a phrase that I use to describe this thing humans do, where we minimize our own experience in order to try and maintain a sense of control over it. We tend to say, oh, this isn't so bad. Oh, it's okay. Yeah, I'm having this thing happen, but it's not as bad as this other thing. Or, this is going on, but really it's fine. I still have a lot of good things in my life. Everything is good. And ignoring how much that one thing is actually affecting us because we want to retain control. That's a very human thing. You can fight this by trying to have the conversation before things get dire, before things start cropping up, or when you start seeing things on the horizon crop up. Have the conversation then. Or you can frame it as a thing that might happen in the future. For instance, you could say, look, I know that, like, as an example, my uncle has had multiple bouts of cancer. I know that it is likely at some point he's going to have another round. I can frame that to my team and say, look, this is a thing that might come up. When it does, we need to be prepared for it. And everybody appreciates a heads up, right? That's not a thing. Everybody's like, yeah, okay, thanks for telling me before everything is suddenly dire. In addition, telling other people might actually help you because other people can often see how something is affecting you more clearly than you can. And using other people to be your kind of first warning system can be really effective. So that's facile optimism. What about fear? How do we fight fear? I'm asking you to do something that is really hard. Probably in the moment, it is going to be the hardest. All right. If you're in the middle of something going on that is affecting you emotionally, that is a really hard time to talk to other people about how it's affecting you emotionally because you're just adding on to that burden. All right. And I understand that. You can do this after an experience, but it's less effective. So I recommend preparing for it before it happens. Writing down almost a set of steps. Who are you going to tell if something actually happens? Can you work with them to set up a plan for how you'll tell them? Say, hey, this thing might happen. How do you want to be informed? How would you like me to come at you at this moment with what's going on? Or what habits can you form now that will help you if something happens? Are there things you can take up, meditation, whatever other kind of supercharging techniques you want to add to your life that will help you weather bigger storms? If you're still in that moment, you have to find that time to make that mental space. Whatever you need to do to gather up enough energy to have that conversation, do it. Because you need to have the conversation, because not talking about it means that you're, again, trying to sweep that under the rug. And your coworkers are going to see and know not what's going on, but that something is going on. And now you're down that spiral of they're going to tell a negative story and they're not going to ask you about it. And you're going to tell yourself a negative story and not tell them about it. As far as fighting shame, this is really a problem. So it's time for some art truths. Yeah. If you are struggling with your own experiences, whether you have a diagnosis or not, if you're struggling with something in your own life, you are not going to go psycho. You are not less than human. You are not incapable of functioning. You are not worth less than normal people. You are not less intelligent. You are not dangerous. And you are not broken. And you are still capable of having human relationships. You are still capable of making decisions about your own life. You are still capable of participating in every part of that life. And you are still capable of logical, rational thought. It is okay to not be okay. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You don't. That's something that we don't hear enough. And it's really hard to internalize. Trust me, I know. I've this has been in my head for God knows how many years at this point, and it's still, I catch myself being ashamed, not being all right with the fact that I'm having a problem in the moment. You can also seek support from those that you already trust. If you have trusted coworkers, trusted friends, family members, etc., seeking support from them can help you feel less of that shame. So, all right, we're coming into the home stretch now. Hopefully, I've made the pitch to you that this is something you should talk about. And hopefully, I've given you some of the tools to talk about it and to fight some of the things that come up. But let's deal with some of the what ifs that have probably cropped up in your head over the course of this presentation, all right? Questions that I found myself asking, that I've heard other people ask, that I want to try and answer for you so we can move past them. So what if nobody trusts me anymore? What if I say this and suddenly nobody trusts me? Well, I mentioned it earlier, but being honest and vulnerable actually tends to improve trust in people. If you are honest about what is happening to you, people tend to trust you more, not less. And in the cases where they do trust you less, or you feel like they trust you less, you can have that conversation up front. Bring it up explicitly. Feel like you no longer trust me. What can I do to regain your trust? But what if everybody treats me like I'm fragile? I've literally spoken with somebody who was passed over for multiple promotions after he had a mental health challenge at work, or something cropped up where they found out about it at work. He was passed over for multiple promotions because they didn't want to stress him. Like, that's not stressful. Okay? This is going to crop up, and it's not always from a bad place. Sometimes it's from a very well-meaning, I don't want to stress you, I don't want to hurt you place. And to combat that, you can help people see the boundaries of what's actually stressful to you. Help define the lines for them of, this is my no-go zone, okay? This is the place where we're playing Kenny Rogers, the danger zone. You can also set up a communication plan to tell them when it gets to be too much. If you say beforehand, I'm going to tell you, this is when I start to see these things happening. I'm going to tell you in that moment, I'm going to set up this thing, we're going to talk about it. That can be a way for them to say, okay, well, we have a plan in place to mitigate, to adjust when these things start to crop up. And so that can be a way as well to help get around this feeling fragile thing, or them thinking that you are fragile thing. But what if they don't believe you? Well, this one's real hard, folks. And I have spoken to people who don't believe you, who have not been believed, rather. It's still kind of freaking unreal that this happens in 2020 of all time, but it does happen. And the only thing I can tell you in this case is find other allies and get ready to fight. Find people who do believe you. Find people who are willing to stand up with you and stand for what is actually an injustice. And if you can't do that, or you can't find those people, get out as soon as you can. I know that's not an option for everybody. I know that's problematic in a lot of ways as a suggestion, but that's the only one that I have that is really meaningful, because in a lot of cases, you're not going to change people's minds. Well, what if you get bullied? What if you get fired? Okay. Those are real fears, right? Again, try and use your best judgment on this stuff, all right? Only you can make the call if your particular situation is safe. And in fact, at least in the US, you're relying on your company's HR department to be in your corner. And most of the time, they are not. They're there for the company, not for you. They're not your friend. So it's really, really difficult to do this sometimes. If you're curious about if things are safe, my recommendation is throw up a trial balloon, all right? Take something small, relatively safe, and share that with your team. I'm feeling down because of X, Y, and Z. I'm feeling this thing because this thing happened. Something, nothing like, doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be dramatic. See what happens with it. If you start, for instance, you share it with somebody and then you hear it as gossip from like 3 other people, you might not be in a place where you're safe enough to be able to do this. So that hopefully gets you over some of the roadblocks, those final roadblocks to getting through this. So what can you do tomorrow to actually address this stuff? Well, first, ask yourself, is there anything big going on right now or anything likely to happen in your near future? Just look out in the future and say, what things that are going to affect me emotionally are coming up? And then if anything is, set up your plans for if and when something happens. How are you going to know that you're starting to have these things affect you? How are you to know if something is getting too much? And what are you going to do when that happens? You can start listening closely to your team to see if it's safe to share, to throw up those trial balloons like I talked about. And you might even just directly bring up the idea of sharing feelings with your team. Instead of retros being just the good, bad, ugly, or whatever the heck your team particularly does, maybe we have a section where you actually talk about, this is how I felt about the past sprint. All of those are things you can do right now, like tomorrow. Well, assuming you're probably coming to the conference tomorrow. So let's just say Monday. Okay, so that was a lot. Pull out some of the major takeaways. Your thoughts and your emotions affect your work. Being able to discuss your experience with your coworkers is important to your team's resilience. And you can enable those discussions by using experiential language, by being descriptive and not prescriptive, by being compassionate, and by recognizing that just because you know for one person doesn't mean you know for everyone. You can avoid facile optimism by developing plans beforehand. And you have to remember that you are stronger than your fear. And you have to remember that you need to own that experience, that we need to own your lived experience in the world, that you have nothing to be ashamed of. Because you do not need to go through the workday carrying that load alone. There's a better option. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, you can dump them in the chat. I've been watching the WebEx chat. I've not been watching the Slack one. I'll go check that right now. If you have any questions about personal questions or things that you want to ask me personally, you can hit me up on the Slack. My Twitter handle is down there. My DMs are always open. If you want to talk about anything, please let me know. Or you can send me an email. My website has my email and the rest of the contact info. So let's see. Do we have any questions in the Slack?